In the marble halls of federal justice, where power and precedent collide, one moment of attempted humiliation would expose a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of the judicial system. What seemed like a routine hearing between Judge Victoria Sterling and prosecutor Elena Rodriguez would become the catalyst for the most stunning courtroom reversal in modern legal history. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted, and those who abuse their authority discover that justice has a way of finding its mark. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Theodore Morrison Federal Courthouse in downtown Richmond, casting long shadows across the polished granite floors. The building itself was a monument to justice, with its towering columns and intricate stonework that spoke of permanence and authority. But on this particular Tuesday morning in March, the very foundations of that authority were about to be shaken to their core. Elena Rodriguez adjusted her navy blazer as she walked through the security checkpoint, her heels clicking against the marble with the confident rhythm of someone who had navigated these halls countless times before. At 34, she had already earned a reputation as one of the most tenacious federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of Virginia. Her dark hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and her brown eyes held the sharp focus of someone who never entered a courtroom unprepared. Elena carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had fought for every opportunity in her life. The daughter of immigrants from El Salvador, she had worked her way through law school, waiting tables at night and studying by lamplight in a cramped apartment she shared with 3 roommates. Every case she prosecuted carried the weight of her family's sacrifices and her community's hopes. She didn't just practice law, she embodied the principle that justice should be blind to background, wealth, or connections. This morning, she was preparing for what should have been a straightforward hearing. The case involved Marcus Chen, a brilliant young computer programmer who had stumbled upon evidence of a massive financial fraud scheme while working as a contractor for a prominent investment firm. What Marcus had discovered was a sophisticated operation that had siphoned millions from pension funds, leaving thousands of retirees facing poverty in their golden years. Elena had spent 8 months building an airtight case against the masterminds behind the scheme. The evidence was overwhelming: financial records, encrypted communications, witness testimony, and digital forensics that painted a clear picture of deliberate criminal conspiracy. She had traced the money through shell companies and offshore accounts, unraveling a web of deception that stretched across multiple states. But as Elena prepared her opening statement in the conference room adjacent to courtroom 7B, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The case had been randomly assigned to Judge Victoria Sterling, a Reagan appointee known for her rigid adherence to procedure and her sometimes caustic demeanor toward prosecutors she deemed unprepared. Sterling had a reputation for running her courtroom with an iron fist, and attorneys who appeared before her often joked nervously about feeling like they were back in grade school, facing a particularly stern principal. What Elena didn't know was that Judge Sterling had spent the previous evening in a heated phone conversation with someone whose voice would have been instantly recognizable to anyone who followed financial news. The judge's personal investment portfolio, managed through a series of carefully concealed trusts, was deeply intertwined with the very firms that Elena's prosecution threatened to expose. Victoria Sterling had built her judicial career on the foundation of appearing above reproach. At 62, she commanded respect through a combination of legal scholarship and strategic networking that had elevated her from a small-town prosecutor to the federal bench. Her silver hair was always perfectly styled, her black robes pressed to perfection, and her demeanor crafted to project unwavering authority. But beneath the polished exterior, Sterling harbored a secret that would have ended her career instantly if exposed. For nearly a decade, she had been accepting what amounted to bribes disguised as investment opportunities, speaking fees for private events, and consulting arrangements that conveniently never required any actual consulting. The scheme was sophisticated, designed by financial professionals who understood exactly how to structure payments to avoid detection while ensuring Sterling's cooperation when needed. The judge entered her chambers that morning with a plan that she believed would end Elena's prosecution before it could threaten her hidden interests. She had crafted what appeared to be legally sound reasons to dismiss the case, focusing on technical procedural issues that would give her cover while protecting her co-conspirators. Sterling had convinced herself that she was simply exercising judicial discretion, but the truth was far more sinister. As the morning proceeded, Elena noticed unusual activity around the courthouse. Federal agents seemed to be positioned at various exits, and there was an unmistakable tension in the air that experienced attorneys could sense like approaching thunder. She attributed it to the high-profile nature of her case, unaware that a parallel investigation had been quietly building for months. Special Agent David Kim of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit had been investigating judicial misconduct for over a year. A former Marine turned federal agent, Kim possessed the patience of a sniper and the methodical approach of an accountant. His investigation into Sterling had begun with a seemingly unrelated tip about unusual financial activity, but it had grown into something far more significant than anyone had anticipated. Kim's team had been monitoring Sterling's communications for weeks, building a comprehensive picture of her corrupt activities. They had traced payments, documented meetings, and gathered evidence that painted a clear picture of a sitting federal judge who had essentially been purchased by powerful financial interests. The timing of their move was carefully calculated to coincide with the Chen hearing, when Sterling's corruption would be most visible. Elena entered courtroom 7B at exactly 9 o'clock, her trial bag organized with the precision that had become her trademark. The courtroom was filled with the usual mix of attorneys, court staff, and observers, but Elena noticed several individuals she didn't recognize sitting in the gallery. They had the unmistakable bearing of federal agents, though they wore civilian clothes and tried to blend in with the crowd. Marcus Chen sat at the defendant's table with his public defender, an overworked but dedicated attorney named Sarah Walsh. Marcus was nervous but determined, knowing that his testimony could help recover millions of dollars for the victims of the fraud he had uncovered. At 26, he possessed the idealism of someone who still believed that doing the right thing would ultimately be rewarded, even when it came at significant personal cost. The investment firm's defense team occupied the other side of the courtroom, led by Harrison Blackwood, a partner at one of the city's most prestigious white-shoe law firms. Blackwood's silver hair and custom-tailored suit projected the kind of establishment authority that often intimidated younger prosecutors. But Elena had faced his type before and remained undaunted. When Judge Sterling entered the courtroom, everyone rose as protocol demanded. She moved with practiced authority to her bench, her black robes flowing like ceremonial vestments of power. But those who knew her well might have noticed a subtle tension in her shoulders, a slight tightness around her eyes that suggested someone operating under unusual stress. Elena began her opening statement with the methodical precision that had made her successful. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She outlined the evidence systematically, explaining how Marcus Chen's discovery had revealed a conspiracy that had robbed retirees of their life savings. Her voice was steady and professional, but those who listened carefully could hear the underlying passion that drove her commitment to justice. As Elena spoke, she noticed that Judge Sterling seemed distracted, frequently glancing toward the gallery where the unidentified observers sat. The judge's usual laser focus appeared scattered, and she interrupted Elena's presentation more frequently than normal with questions that seemed designed to derail rather than clarify. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when Sterling sustained an objection from the defense that Elena knew was legally baseless. The ruling was so obviously incorrect that even the court reporter looked up in surprise. Elena felt a cold knot forming in her stomach as she realized that the judge might not be the impartial arbiter she had expected. Sterling's bias became increasingly obvious as the morning progressed. She allowed the defense broad latitude while restricting Elena's ability to present her evidence. Every ruling seemed calculated to hamstring the prosecution, and Sterling's questions to Elena carried a condescending tone that bordered on outright hostility. The moment that would change everything came when Elena attempted to introduce a crucial piece of evidence, a recording that Marcus had made of his supervisors discussing the fraudulent scheme. The recording was clearly admissible under established federal rules, but Sterling ruled it inadmissible based on a tortured interpretation of evidentiary standards that no legitimate legal scholar would have supported. Elena stood frozen for a moment, recognizing that she was witnessing judicial corruption in real time. The ruling was so obviously wrong, so transparently biased, that it could only be explained by Sterling's personal investment in the case's outcome. Elena's mind raced as she considered her options, knowing that challenging a federal judge directly was career suicide, but understanding that allowing this injustice to continue would betray everything she believed in. What Sterling didn't know was that Agent Kim and his team were recording every word of the hearing through sophisticated surveillance equipment they had installed in the courtroom weeks earlier. Every biased ruling, every inappropriate interruption, every obvious attempt to sabotage the prosecution was being captured for posterity. Elena took a deep breath and made a decision that would define her career. Looking directly at Judge Sterling, she spoke in a voice that carried throughout the courtroom with crystal clarity. "Your Honor, I must respectfully request that you recuse yourself from this case. Your rulings this morning have demonstrated a pattern of bias that calls into question your ability to fairly adjudicate these proceedings." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Attorneys stopped taking notes, court staff looked up from their desks, and even the usually stoic bailiff appeared shocked. In 30 years of practice, many of the observers had never witnessed a prosecutor directly challenge a federal judge's integrity in open court. Sterling's face flushed red with anger, her carefully maintained composure cracking like ice under pressure. She leaned forward on the bench, her voice dripping with condescension and barely controlled rage. "Counselor Rodriguez, you are clearly out of your depth in this courtroom. Your obvious inexperience and unprofessional conduct suggest that perhaps you should consider whether federal prosecution is the appropriate career path for someone of your limited capabilities. I am holding you in contempt of court and fining you $5,000 for this outrageous display of disrespect." The words hung in the air like poison, each syllable calculated to humiliate and destroy Elena's credibility. Sterling had crossed a line that experienced judges never crossed, allowing her personal animosity and corrupt interests to override basic judicial ethics. She had just provided Agent Kim's team with the smoking gun they needed to complete their case. Elena stood straighter, refusing to be diminished by Sterling's attack. She had faced prejudice and condescension throughout her career, and she recognized Sterling's words for what they were, an attempt to silence someone who threatened a corrupt system. Her voice remained steady as she responded. "Your Honor, I stand by my request for recusal. The record will reflect my position, and I trust that appellate courts will review these proceedings with the attention they deserve." Sterling's anger reached a boiling point. She began to craft another harsh response, perhaps sensing that her authority was being challenged in a way that threatened her entire judicial career. But before she could speak, the courtroom doors opened with a sharp bang that echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Agent Kim strode into the courtroom, flanked by 6 other federal agents, their credentials held high and their purpose unmistakable. The agents moved with military precision, their presence immediately transforming the atmosphere from judicial proceeding to criminal arrest. Kim's voice carried the authority of federal law enforcement as he addressed the stunned courtroom. "This is Special Agent David Kim, Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a federal warrant for the arrest of Judge Victoria Sterling on charges of bribery, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Your Honor, you are under arrest." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Attorneys scrambled to their feet, court staff looked around in confusion, and the gallery buzzed with shocked whispers. Sterling's face went from red to ashen white as the full implications of her situation became clear. The corrupt empire she had built over a decade was collapsing in a matter of minutes. Elena watched in amazement as Agent Kim approached the bench with practiced professionalism. He read Sterling her Miranda rights in a clear, steady voice, while 2 other agents positioned themselves to prevent any attempt at escape. The judge who had attempted to humiliate Elena moments earlier was now being treated like any other criminal. Suspect. Sterling's hands shook as she was led down from the bench, her black robe suddenly seeming like a costume rather than a symbol of authority. The handcuffs clicked into place with a sound that seemed to echo through the marble halls of justice. As she was escorted from the courtroom, Sterling's eyes met Elena's for a brief moment, and in that glance, Elena saw not arrogance or anger, but the hollow desperation of someone whose world had just collapsed. The arrest was the culmination of Agent Kim's year-long investigation, but it was also the beginning of a much larger story. As Elena would soon discover, Sterling's corruption was connected to a network of judicial misconduct that reached far beyond a single courtroom. The evidence that Kim's team had gathered painted a picture of systematic corruption that threatened the very foundations of federal justice. Marcus Chen sat in stunned silence as the agents led Sterling away, hardly able to process what he had witnessed. His decision to report the financial fraud had seemed like a simple matter of doing the right thing. But now he found himself at the center of a scandal that would reshape his understanding of how justice actually worked in America. Sarah Walsh, Marcus's public defender, gathered her papers with hands that trembled slightly from adrenaline. She had practiced law for 15 years without ever witnessing anything like Sterling's arrest, and she knew that this moment would become a defining memory of her career. The system she had devoted her life to serving had just demonstrated both its capacity for corruption and its ultimate commitment to accountability. Harrison Blackwood and his defense team sat frozen at their table, recognizing that Sterling's arrest had fundamentally altered their case. The judge they had been counting on to protect their clients was now facing federal charges herself, and the carefully constructed defense strategy they had developed was suddenly worthless. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Elena remained at the prosecutor's table, trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. She had entered the courthouse that morning, prepared for a routine hearing, but she was leaving as a key witness in one of the most significant judicial corruption cases in recent memory. Agent Kim approached Elena as she gathered her papers, his expression serious but respectful. He introduced himself properly and explained that her courage in challenging Sterling's bias had provided crucial evidence for the FBI's case. Elena, learned that her entire exchange with Sterling had been recorded and that her willingness to stand up to judicial corruption had helped ensure that justice would ultimately prevail. The investigation that led to Sterling's arrest had actually begun 18 months earlier, when a whistleblower inside a major investment firm had contacted the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. The initial tip had seemed routine, another allegation of financial misconduct that might or might not lead to criminal charges. But as Agent Kim's team began digging deeper, they uncovered connections that surprised even seasoned investigators. The whistleblower was an accountant named Patricia Hendricks, who had discovered unusual payments flowing from her firm to shell companies controlled by various public officials. Patricia had the methodical mind of a forensic accountant and the moral courage of someone who refused to be complicit in criminal activity. Her detailed records became the foundation for an investigation that would eventually expose corruption. Across multiple government agencies, Agent Kim's team had used sophisticated financial analysis to trace the money flowing to Sterling's hidden accounts. They discovered that the judge had received over $2 million in disguised payments over the course of 8 years, money that had been carefully laundered through investment vehicles designed to avoid detection. The payments correlated directly with favorable rulings that Sterling had issued in cases involving the firms that were paying her. The FBI had obtained warrants to monitor Sterling's communications, both electronic and physical. They had recorded phone calls, intercepted emails, and documented meetings that provided clear evidence of the quid pro quo relationship between Sterling and her co-conspirators. The surveillance had revealed a judge who had essentially been purchased by financial interests that sought to manipulate the federal court system for their own benefit. Elena's case against Marcus Chen's former employer had provided the perfect opportunity for the FBI to catch Sterling in the act of judicial corruption. The agents had known that Sterling would attempt to sabotage Elena's prosecution, and they had positioned themselves to document every biased ruling and inappropriate comment. Elena's challenge to Sterling's bias had been the final piece of evidence. They needed to make their case. As news of Sterling's arrest spread throughout the legal community, Elena found herself at the center of a media storm she had never anticipated. Legal journalists who covered federal court proceedings recognized the significance of what had occurred, and Elena's role in exposing Sterling's corruption made her a central figure in the story. But Elena remained focused on her primary responsibility, ensuring that Marcus Chen's case proceeded fairly and that the victims of the financial fraud received justice. With Sterling removed from the case, Elena knew that she would finally have the opportunity to present her evidence without judicial interference. The random reassignment of the case brought it before Judge Margaret Thompson, a Carter appointee known for her meticulous attention to detail and absolute commitment to judicial ethics. Thompson had built her reputation over 3 decades on the bench by treating every case with the same level of care and impartiality, regardless of the parties involved or the political implications. Elena's preparation for the new proceedings took on added significance as she realized that the entire legal community would be watching to see how the case progressed under legitimate judicial oversight. The evidence she had been prevented from, presenting under Sterling's corrupt rule, would finally see the light of day. Marcus Chen's testimony proved to be devastating to the defense. His detailed account of discovering the fraudulent scheme, combined with the documentary evidence Elena had gathered, painted a clear picture of deliberate criminal conspiracy. Without Sterling's interference, the defense team found themselves unable to overcome the overwhelming evidence of their client's guilt. The trial that followed Sterling's arrest became a landmark case in federal prosecution of financial fraud. Elena's methodical presentation of evidence, combined with Marcus's compelling testimony, resulted in convictions for all defendants involved in the scheme. The sentences imposed by Judge Thompson reflected the magnitude of the crime and sent a clear message that financial fraud would not be tolerated. But the most significant impact of Sterling's arrest extended far beyond Elena's individual case. The FBI's investigation had uncovered evidence of corruption involving multiple judges and dozens of cases. Agent Kim's team worked with federal prosecutors to build cases against Sterling's co-conspirators, ultimately resulting in the largest judicial corruption prosecution in the district's history. Patricia Hendricks, the accountant whose initial tip had started the investigation, testified before a grand jury about the systematic nature of the corruption she had discovered. Her detailed financial records provided the roadmap that allowed investigators to trace corrupt payments across multiple jurisdictions and uncover the full scope of the criminal enterprise. The investigation revealed that Sterling's corruption was part of a larger pattern of judicial misconduct that had affected dozens of cases over nearly a decade. Appeals courts ordered new trials for cases where Sterling's bias had potentially affected the outcomes, and several convicted defendants who had been railroaded by Sterling's corrupt rulings were ultimately exonerated. Elena's role in exposing Sterling's corruption earned her recognition from law enforcement agencies and civil rights organizations across the country. She received awards for prosecutorial excellence and judicial integrity, but the recognition that meant the most to her came from the victims of the financial fraud whose money was ultimately recovered and returned. Marcus Chen's life was transformed by his decision to report the financial fraud he had discovered. Initially facing potential criminal charges himself, he became a key witness whose testimony helped convict the real perpetrators. The prosecutor's office worked with immigration authorities to ensure that Marcus's family, who had been facing deportation proceedings, could remain in the United States as a reward for his cooperation and courage. The investment firm that had been the center of the fraud case collapsed within months of the convictions, its reputation destroyed by the evidence of systematic criminal conduct. The firm's assets were liquidated to provide restitution to the thousands of retirees whose pensions had been stolen, and new regulations were implemented to prevent similar schemes in the future. Agent Kim's investigation continued for 2 more years as federal prosecutors worked to dismantle the entire network of corruption that Sterling's arrest had exposed. The case became a model for how law enforcement agencies could work together to combat public corruption, and Kim was eventually promoted to head the FBI's Public Corruption Unit for the entire southeastern region. Judge Thompson's handling of Elena's case became a textbook example of proper judicial conduct. Law schools across the country used transcripts from the proceedings to teach students about the importance of judicial impartiality and the appropriate relationship between judges and attorneys. Thompson's careful attention to procedural fairness provided a stark contrast to Sterling's corrupt conduct. Elena's career flourished in the years following Sterling's arrest. She was promoted to the position of Chief Deputy Federal Prosecutor and eventually became the first Latina to serve as United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia. Her office became known for its aggressive prosecution of public corruption and its commitment to protecting the rights of all citizens regardless of their background. The courthouse where Sterling's arrest had occurred was renamed in honor of Justice Thurgood Marshall, reflecting the legal community's commitment to the principles of equal justice under law that Sterling had violated. A plaque in the main lobby commemorated the importance of judicial integrity and the courage required to challenge corruption wherever it is found. Sarah Walsh, Marcus Chen's public defender, left her position in the public defender's office to join Elena's prosecution team as a specialist in financial crimes. Her experience defending Marcus had given her insights into how financial fraud affected ordinary people, and she brought that perspective to her work as a prosecutor, seeking justice for victims of white-collar crime. Harrison Blackwood, the defense attorney whose clients had been convicted in Elena's case, faced disciplinary proceedings for his role in attempting to benefit from Sterling's corruption. While he avoided criminal charges, his law firm dissolved under the weight of the scandal, and Blackwood eventually left private practice to teach legal ethics at a small regional law school. The media coverage of Sterling's arrest and trial brought national attention to the issue of judicial corruption and the importance of prosecutorial independence. Elena appeared before congressional committees to testify about the need for stronger oversight of federal judges and better protections for prosecutors who challenge judicial misconduct. Sterling herself was ultimately sentenced to 12 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to charges of bribery, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Her fall from the federal bench to a federal prison cell became a cautionary tale about the consequences of betraying the public trust and the ultimate accountability of all public officials. The network of financial firms that had been paying Sterling bribes faced their own reckoning as federal prosecutors pursued criminal and civil cases against the companies and individuals involved. Millions of dollars in fines and restitution payments were collected, and new compliance programs were implemented to prevent future corruption. Patricia Hendricks, the accountant whose tip had started the entire investigation, received recognition from law enforcement agencies and whistleblower protection organizations. Her courage in reporting financial misconduct despite potential retaliation from her employer demonstrated the crucial role that ordinary citizens play in maintaining the integrity of the justice system. As Elena reflected on the events that had transformed her life and career, she recognized that Sterling's attempt to humiliate her had ultimately exposed a corrupt system that had been operating in shadows for years. The courage she had shown in challenging Sterling's bias had not only protected her own case, but had helped ensure that justice could prevail for countless other victims. The story of Elena Rodriguez and Judge Victoria Sterling became more than just another corruption case. It became a symbol of how individual courage could triumph over institutional corruption. Elena's refusal to be intimidated by Sterling's abuse of authority had demonstrated that even the most powerful officials could be held accountable when dedicated public servants were willing to stand up for justice. In the end, Sterling's attempt to humiliate Elena had backfired spectacularly, leading not to the prosecutor's downfall, but to the judge's own arrest and imprisonment. The moment when Sterling had tried to destroy Elena's credibility had instead become the final piece of evidence needed to destroy Sterling's own corrupt career. The courthouse where it all began continued to serve as a symbol of justice, but now it carried an additional meaning, as a place where corruption had been exposed and defeated. Elena's name was added to the honor roll of prosecutors who had distinguished themselves in service to justice, and her example inspired a new generation of attorneys to pursue careers in public service. The investigation that began with Sterling's arrest continued to reverberate through the legal system for years, leading to reforms in judicial oversight, prosecutorial independence, and financial transparency. The case became a landmark example of how the justice system could police itself when corruption was discovered and addressed with courage and determination. Elena Rodriguez had entered that courthouse on a March morning as a federal prosecutor, preparing for a routine hearing. She left as a symbol of prosecutorial courage and judicial accountability, having played a crucial role in exposing one of the most significant corruption scandals in federal court history. Her willingness to challenge authority when justice demanded it had not only protected her own case, but had helped restore faith in the fundamental principle that no one, not even a federal judge, is above the law. The reverberations from Victoria Sterling's arrest echoed through the federal courthouse like aftershocks from an earthquake. Within hours of the judge being led away in handcuffs, emergency meetings were convening in law offices across the city, as attorneys scrambled to assess the implications for their pending cases. The carefully orchestrated world of federal litigation had been thrown into chaos, and everyone connected to Sterling's courtroom was suddenly under scrutiny. Elena Rodriguez found herself at the epicenter of this legal storm, her phone buzzing incessantly with calls from reporters, colleagues, and attorneys seeking information about what they had witnessed. She had declined all media interviews, understanding that her role as a prosecutor required discretion, even in the face of extraordinary circumstances. But privately, she was grappling with the magnitude of what had unfolded and the realization that her confrontation with Sterling had been recorded as evidence in a federal corruption investigation. Agent David Kim established a command center in a conference room on the courthouse's third floor, where his team began the massive task of reviewing every case that had appeared before Sterling over the past decade. The investigation had revealed patterns of corruption that extended far beyond Elena's financial fraud case, and Kim's agents were now working around the clock to identify other instances where Sterling's bias had potentially affected judicial outcomes. The evidence they uncovered painted a disturbing picture of systematic judicial misconduct. Financial records showed that Sterling had received payments coinciding with favorable rulings in dozens of cases involving everything from environmental regulations to immigration proceedings. Each payment had been carefully disguised through shell companies and investment vehicles, but Kim's forensic accountants had traced the money with methodical precision. Dr. Margaret Lawson, a retired federal judge brought in to oversee the reassignment of Sterling's cases, worked from a temporary office established specifically for this unprecedented situation. At 71, Lawson had seen every imaginable form of legal misconduct during her 4 decades on the bench, but even she was shocked by the scope of Sterling's corruption. The task before her was monumental, reviewing hundreds of cases to determine which ones required new proceedings due to Sterling's compromised decisions. Elena's own case had been reassigned to Judge Robert Martinez, a Clinton appointee known for his fairness and legal scholarship. Martinez had agreed to expedite the proceedings, recognizing that the financial fraud victims deserved swift justice after years of litigation delays. Elena found herself preparing for trial under intense media scrutiny, knowing that legal observers across the country would be watching to see how the case proceeded under legitimate judicial oversight. Marcus Chen had become something of a reluctant celebrity following Sterling's arrest. His role as the whistleblower who had uncovered the original financial fraud had taken on new significance now that it was connected to judicial corruption. Immigration advocacy groups had rallied to support Marcus and his family, arguing that his courage in exposing corruption deserved recognition and protection from deportation proceedings that had been initiated before the fraud was discovered. The financial firm at the center of Elena's case was hemorrhaging clients and facing regulatory investigations that threatened its very existence. Internal documents subpoenaed by federal investigators revealed that the company's executives had been aware of their criminal exposure and had specifically sought out corrupt judges who could be relied upon to protect their interests. Sterling's name appeared repeatedly in email communications discussing strategies for avoiding prosecution. Agent Kim's investigation had expanded to include the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Unit. The multi-agency task force was following money trails that led to offshore banking centers and shell companies incorporated in states with minimal disclosure requirements. The complexity of the financial arrangements suggested a level of sophistication that indicated professional money laundering services. Patricia Hendricks, the accountant whose initial tip had triggered the investigation, was now working directly with federal prosecutors as a cooperating witness. Her detailed knowledge of the financial industry's inner workings proved invaluable in deciphering the complex transactions that had been used to funnel money to Sterling and other corrupt officials. Patricia's decision to come forward had required enormous personal courage, as she faced potential retaliation from powerful financial interests. The investigation revealed that Sterling's corruption had not operated in isolation. Phone records and email communications showed regular contact between Sterling and other federal judges, who were now under investigation for similar misconduct. The network of corruption appeared to span multiple judicial districts and involved coordination between judges, attorneys, and financial industry executives. Elena received a call from Assistant Attorney General Catherine Walsh, who was overseeing the Justice Department's response to the unfolding scandal. Walsh had been monitoring the situation from Washington and was impressed by Elena's handling of the Sterling confrontation. The Assistant Attorney General was considering Elena for a position in the Justice Department's Public Integrity section, recognizing that prosecutors with Elena's combination of courage and competence were essential for combating public corruption. The reassignment of Sterling's cases created a logistical nightmare for the courthouse administration. Chief Judge William Harrison worked 18-hour days, coordinating with other judges to absorb Sterling's caseload while ensuring that constitutional speedy trial requirements were met. Harrison had served as chief judge for 6 years and had never faced a crisis of this magnitude, but his calm leadership helped maintain stability during a period of unprecedented upheaval. Local law schools scrambled to adjust their curricula to address the Sterling scandal, recognizing that future attorneys needed to understand both the mechanics of judicial corruption and the ethical obligations of prosecutors who encountered such misconduct. Professor Linda Chen at Richmond Law School developed a new course on prosecutorial ethics that used Elena's confrontation with Sterling as a case study in professional courage. The Virginia State Bar launched its own investigation into attorney conduct in Sterling's courtroom, focusing on whether defense attorneys had been aware of the judge's corruption and had failed to report it as required by professional ethics rules. Several prominent attorneys faced disciplinary proceedings for their apparent complicity in Sterling's scheme, and the legal community began grappling with questions about collective responsibility for policing judicial misconduct. Elena's preparation for the Marcus Chen trial took on added significance as she realized that the proceedings would be viewed as a test of the justice system's ability to function properly after Sterling's corruption was exposed. Every aspect of her case would be scrutinized by legal experts looking for evidence that the system could self-correct when corruption was discovered and addressed. Judge Martinez proved to be everything that Sterling had not been: fair, impartial, and genuinely committed to ensuring that both sides received equal treatment under the law. His preliminary rulings in Elena's case demonstrated a careful attention to legal precedent and constitutional requirements that stood in stark contrast to Sterling's biased decision-making. The difference was immediately apparent to everyone. In the courtroom, the defense team representing the financial firm's executives found themselves in an impossible position. Their previous strategy had relied on Sterling's cooperation to exclude damaging evidence and bias proceedings in their favor. Without Sterling's protection, they faced the prospect of defending their clients based solely on the legal merits of their case, and those merits were decidedly weak given the overwhelming evidence of fraud. Marcus Chen's testimony before the grand jury investigating Sterling's corruption provided crucial evidence about how the judge's bias had affected his case. Marcus described Sterling's obvious hostility toward Elena and her attempts to prevent the prosecution from presenting evidence of the financial fraud. His detailed recollections helped federal prosecutors establish the quid pro quo relationship between Sterling's corrupt rulings and the payments she had received. Agent Kim's team discovered that Sterling's corruption had affected cases involving some of the most vulnerable members of society. Immigration proceedings had been rigged against asylum seekers whose cases threatened the interests of Sterling's financial benefactors. Environmental cases had been decided in favor of polluting companies that had paid for Sterling's cooperation. The scope of injustice created by Sterling's corruption was staggering in its breadth and devastating in its impact. The investigation uncovered evidence that Sterling had been planning to retire within 2 years, timing her departure to maximize her pension benefits while avoiding detection of her corrupt activities. Financial records showed that she had been moving money to offshore accounts in preparation for a comfortable retirement funded by her criminal proceeds. The FBI's intervention had prevented Sterling from escaping accountability for her crimes. Elena's case against the financial firm's executives proceeded smoothly under Judge Martinez's oversight. Without Sterling's interference, Elena was able to present her evidence methodically and comprehensively. The recording that Sterling had excluded was admitted without objection, and Marcus Chen's testimony about discovering the fraud was compelling and credible. The defense team's objections were considered fairly and ruled upon based on established legal precedent. The trial attracted national media attention as legal journalists recognized its significance as the first major case to proceed after Sterling's arrest. Court TV obtained permission to broadcast portions of the proceedings, and Elena found herself defending justice not just for the fraud victims, but for the integrity of the entire federal court system. The pressure was intense, but Elena drew strength from her conviction that she was fighting for principles larger than any individual case. Marcus Chen's family attended every day of the trial, their presence serving as a reminder of what was at stake for ordinary people affected by financial fraud and judicial corruption. Marcus's parents had immigrated to the United States seeking opportunities for their children, and they watched with pride as their son testified truthfully despite personal risks. Their faith in American justice had been tested by Sterling's corruption, but was being restored by Elena's principled prosecution. The evidence presented during the trial revealed the devastating impact of the financial fraud on its victims. Elderly retirees testified about losing their life savings to the scheme, and pension fund administrators described the sophisticated methods used to conceal the theft of retirement funds. The human cost of the financial crime was enormous, affecting thousands of families who had trusted their financial security to professionals who betrayed that trust. Elena's closing argument tied together the evidence of financial fraud with the broader themes of accountability and justice that had emerged from Sterling's arrest. She reminded the jury that their verdict would send a message about whether powerful individuals could escape responsibility for their crimes, and she challenged them to deliver justice for the victims who had been robbed of their financial security. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts against the financial firm's executives. The swift verdict reflected the overwhelming strength of Elena's evidence and the jury's recognition that the defendants had committed serious crimes that deserved punishment. The convictions represented not only justice for the fraud victims, but vindication for Elena's decision to challenge Sterling's corruption. Judge Martinez sentenced the defendants to substantial prison terms that reflected the magnitude of their crimes and the harm they had caused to their victims. The sentences sent a clear message that financial fraud would be prosecuted vigorously, and that corrupt schemes would not be tolerated regardless of the wealth or connections of the perpetrators. The contrast with Sterling's biased approach to justice could not have been more stark. Agent Kim's investigation continued to expand as new evidence emerged about the network of corruption that had operated within the federal court system. Wiretaps and financial records revealed communications between multiple judges and the financial interests that had been paying for favorable treatment. The investigation had grown into the largest judicial corruption case in the district's history. The revelation that Sterling's corruption was part of a broader network sent shockwaves through the legal establishment. Bar associations called for enhanced judicial oversight and stronger ethical training for federal judges. Law enforcement agencies began reviewing cases in other districts where similar patterns of corruption might have occurred. The Sterling scandal had exposed systematic weaknesses in judicial accountability that demanded comprehensive reform. Elena received recognition from numerous law enforcement and civil rights organizations for her role in exposing Sterling's corruption. The awards and commendations were gratifying, but Elena remained focused on her core mission of prosecuting cases fairly and protecting the rights of all citizens. She understood that her confrontation with Sterling had been just one moment in a larger struggle to maintain the integrity of the justice system. The financial firm at the center of Elena's case declared bankruptcy within months of the criminal convictions, its reputation destroyed by the evidence of systematic fraud and corruption. The firm's assets were liquidated to provide restitution to the victims of the fraud scheme, and new regulations were implemented to prevent similar criminal enterprises from operating in the future. Patricia Hendricks testified before Congress about the need for stronger whistleblower protections and better oversight of financial industry practices. Her detailed knowledge of how financial fraud schemes operated provided valuable insights for legislators crafting new regulations. Patricia's courage in coming forward had not only helped expose Sterling's corruption, but had also contributed to broader reforms designed to prevent future financial crimes. The courthouse where Sterling's arrest had occurred became a symbol of both the potential for corruption within the justice system and its ultimate capacity for self-correction. Tours of the building now included information about the Sterling case as an example of how individual courage could triumph over institutional corruption. Elena's confrontation with Sterling was featured prominently in these presentations as a model of prosecutorial integrity. Agent Kim was promoted to lead a new FBI unit specifically focused on judicial corruption, reflecting the Bureau's recognition that Sterling's case was likely not an isolated incident. Kim's methodical approach to financial investigations and his ability to build complex corruption cases made him the ideal choice to head efforts to identify and prosecute similar schemes in other jurisdictions. The Sterling investigation led to reforms in how federal judges' financial interests were monitored and disclosed. New requirements for reporting investment activities and potential conflicts of interest were implemented, and oversight mechanisms were strengthened to detect suspicious patterns of financial activity. The goal was to prevent future corruption schemes while maintaining judicial independence. Elena's success in the Marcus Chen case led to her appointment as the lead prosecutor in several other high-profile financial fraud cases that had been affected by Sterling's corruption. Her reputation for integrity and competence made her the natural choice to handle cases where public confidence in the justice system needed to be restored. Elena embraced these challenges as opportunities to demonstrate that the system could function properly when corruption was eliminated. The impact of Sterling's arrest extended far beyond the immediate criminal cases involved. Law schools across the country began teaching the Sterling case as an example of both judicial corruption and prosecutorial courage. Elena's decision to Challenge Sterling's bias became a model for how attorneys should respond when they encounter judicial misconduct, even when such challenges carry professional risks. Marcus Chen's life was transformed by his decision to report the financial fraud he had discovered. Initially facing potential prosecution himself, he became a hero to fraud victims and a symbol of the importance of whistleblower protections. Immigration authorities granted Marcus and his family permanent resident status in recognition of his cooperation with law enforcement and his contribution to exposing corruption. The network of financial companies that had been paying bribes to Sterling faced comprehensive investigations by multiple federal agencies. Securities and Exchange Commission enforcement actions resulted in massive fines and regulatory sanctions that fundamentally changed how these firms operated. The message was clear that corruption would not be tolerated, regardless of the sophistication of the schemes involved. Judge Martinez's handling of Elena's case became a textbook example of proper judicial conduct that was studied in law schools and judicial training programs. His careful attention to procedural fairness and constitutional requirements provided a stark contrast to Sterling's corrupt approach and demonstrated how the justice system was supposed to function when judges fulfilled their ethical obligations. The Sterling scandal prompted comprehensive reviews of federal court administration and judicial oversight mechanisms. Chief judges in other districts implemented new protocols for monitoring unusual patterns in case assignments and judicial rulings. The goal was to create systems that could detect potential corruption before it became as extensive and damaging as Sterling's scheme had been. Elena's career continued to flourish as she took on increasingly complex and high-profile cases involving public corruption and financial fraud. Her reputation for integrity and competence attracted the attention of Justice Department officials who were looking for prosecutors capable of handling the most sensitive and important cases. Elena's willingness to challenge authority when justice demanded it had marked her as a prosecutor of exceptional courage and principle. The victims of the financial fraud scheme that Elena had prosecuted received substantial restitution payments, funded by the liquidation of the criminal enterprise's assets. Many of the elderly retirees who had lost their life savings were able to recover a significant portion of their losses, providing some measure of justice for the harm they had suffered. The successful prosecution had demonstrated that financial crimes could be prosecuted effectively when corruption was eliminated from the process. Agent Kim's investigation ultimately resulted in indictments against 12 federal judges and dozens of attorneys and financial industry executives who had participated in various corruption schemes. The scope of the criminal enterprise was unprecedented in American legal history, and the prosecutions that followed helped restore public confidence in the justice system's ability to police itself when corruption was discovered. The courthouse, where Sterling's dramatic arrest had occurred, continued to serve as a symbol of justice, but now it carried additional meaning as a place where corruption had been exposed and defeated. Elena's name was added to the building's honor roll of distinguished prosecutors, and her example inspired a new generation of attorneys to pursue careers in public service dedicated to protecting the integrity of the legal system. The investigation that began with Sterling's arrest continued to reverberate through the legal community for years, leading to comprehensive reforms in judicial oversight, prosecutorial independence, and financial transparency. The case became a landmark example of how the justice system could respond effectively to corruption when individuals with courage and integrity were willing to stand up for the principles that made democratic governance possible. Elena Rodriguez had walked into that courthouse as a federal prosecutor, preparing for what she thought would be a routine hearing. She emerged as a symbol of prosecutorial courage and judicial accountability, having played a crucial role in exposing and dismantling one of the most extensive corruption networks in federal court history. Her willingness to challenge Sterling's authority when justice demanded it had protected not only her own case, but the fundamental principle that no one, regardless of their position or power, could be allowed to corrupt the administration of justice. 2 years after Victoria Sterling's arrest, the federal courthouse in Richmond had been transformed into something resembling a fortress of transparency. Every judicial decision was now subject to enhanced review protocols, and a new judicial integrity office had been established to monitor patterns that might indicate corruption or bias. The changes were a direct result of the comprehensive investigation that had followed Sterling's dramatic downfall, but they also represented a fundamental shift in how the federal court system approached accountability. Elena Rodriguez stood before the Senate Judiciary Committee, her hand raised as she took the oath that would make her the youngest United States attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia's history. At 36, she had been nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate in recognition of her extraordinary service in combating public corruption. The chamber was packed with law enforcement officials, civil rights advocates, and journalists who had followed her career since that fateful day when she had challenged Sterling's authority. The confirmation hearing had been remarkably smooth, with senators from both parties praising Elena's integrity and her role in exposing judicial corruption. Even the most partisan members of the committee had acknowledged that Elena's courage in confronting Sterling had helped preserve public confidence in the federal court system. Her nomination had been endorsed by every major law enforcement organization and dozens of civil rights groups. Senator Catherine Morrison, the committee chair, administered the oath with obvious pride. Morrison had been following Elena's career for years and had specifically requested that Elena be considered for the position when it became vacant. The senator understood that the office needed someone with Elena's combination of prosecutorial skill and unwavering commitment to justice, particularly given the ongoing challenges of rebuilding public trust in federal institutions. Agent David Kim, now Assistant Director of the FBI's Public Integrity Section, watched the ceremony from the gallery with quiet satisfaction. His investigation into Sterling's corruption had expanded far beyond what anyone had initially imagined, ultimately resulting in prosecutions across 17 states and fundamental reforms in federal court administration. Kim's methodical approach to building corruption cases had become the model for similar investigations throughout the country. The final tally from Kim's investigation was staggering in its scope. 37 federal judges had been indicted for various forms of corruption, along with hundreds of attorneys, financial executives, and public officials who had participated in schemes to manipulate judicial proceedings. The prosecutions had recovered over $800 million in stolen funds and resulted in prison sentences totaling more than 4 centuries for the convicted defendants. Marcus Chen sat in the front row of the Senate gallery, wearing the uniform of a federal law enforcement agent. Following his crucial role in exposing the original financial fraud, Marcus had been recruited by the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, where he used his computer skills and analytical abilities to trace money laundering schemes. His transformation from potential defendant to federal agent had become one of the most inspiring aspects of the entire Sterling saga. Patricia Hendricks had been awarded the Treasury Secretary's Medal for Exceptional Service in recognition of her role as the whistleblower whose courage had initiated the investigation. Now serving as a senior advisor to the Securities and Exchange Commission, Patricia had helped design new compliance protocols that made it much more difficult for financial firms to engage in the kind of systematic corruption that had characterized Sterling's network. Judge Robert Martinez, who had handled Elena's financial fraud case with such fairness and professionalism, had been appointed to the Court of Appeals by the same president who had nominated Elena for U.S. Attorney. Martinez's elevation was widely seen as recognition of his exemplary judicial conduct during the Sterling crisis and his commitment to restoring public confidence in federal courts. His confirmation hearing had been unanimous. The courtroom where Sterling had been arrested had been renamed the Elena Rodriguez courtroom in honor of her courage in exposing judicial corruption. A bronze plaque near the entrance commemorated the moment when a young prosecutor had risked her career to challenge a corrupt judge, ultimately leading to the largest judicial corruption investigation in American history. Law students from across the country made pilgrimages to see the courtroom where institutional courage had triumphed over systematic corruption. Victoria Sterling herself had served 18 months of her 12-year sentence when she suffered a massive stroke in federal prison. The stroke left her partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly, a condition that some observers viewed as poetic justice for someone who had used her judicial voice to corrupt the administration of justice. Sterling's medical condition had made her eligible for compassionate release, but prosecutors had opposed any reduction in her sentence given the scope of her crimes. The financial restitution program established following the corruption prosecutions had become a model for victim compensation in white-collar crime cases. Over 6,000 individuals had received payments totaling more than $400 million, funds recovered from the assets of convicted defendants, and the fines imposed on corrupt organizations. The program had demonstrated that aggressive prosecution of financial crimes could actually result in meaningful recovery for victims. Elena's first major initiative as U.S. Attorney was the establishment of a new Civil Rights and Public Integrity Division within her office. The unit was specifically designed to investigate and prosecute cases involving government corruption, police misconduct, and violations of constitutional rights. Elena understood that maintaining public trust in democratic institutions required constant vigilance against those who would abuse their authority for personal gain. The division's first major case involved allegations of corruption within the state prison system, where guards and administrators had been accepting bribes to provide special treatment to certain inmates while subjecting others to abuse and neglect. Elena's prosecutors built their case using the same methodical approach that had been successful in the Sterling investigation, following financial records and communications to establish patterns of criminal conduct. Dr. Margaret Lawson, the retired judge who had overseen the reassignment of Sterling's cases, had been appointed to head a new federal judicial conduct commission established by Congress in response to the corruption scandal. The commission was given broad authority to investigate allegations of judicial misconduct and recommend disciplinary actions ranging from censure to impeachment. Lawson's appointment was widely praised as bringing both expertise and integrity to the challenging task of judicial oversight. The Commission's first annual report documented significant improvements in judicial conduct and transparency since the Sterling reforms had been implemented. Reports of potential judicial misconduct had increased dramatically as attorneys became more willing to report inappropriate behavior. But the Commission had also found that the vast majority of federal judges were conducting themselves with proper integrity and professionalism. Elena's office had developed new protocols for handling cases involving potential judicial bias or misconduct. Prosecutors were trained to recognize warning signs of corruption and given clear guidance on how to report concerns without jeopardizing ongoing cases. The protocols emphasized that prosecutors had a duty to the justice system that transcended their obligation to any individual judge or case. The reforms implemented following Sterling's arrest had attracted international attention from legal systems struggling with their own corruption challenges. Delegations from dozens of countries had visited Elena's office to study the American approach to combating judicial corruption, and Elena had testified before international tribunals about best practices for maintaining judicial integrity. Marcus Chen's work with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network had led to the identification of several other potential corruption schemes involving public officials and financial institutions. His analytical skills and understanding of complex financial transactions made him particularly effective at spotting patterns that indicated criminal activity. Marcus had become one of the most valued investigators in the federal government's anti-corruption arsenal. The law school where Professor Linda Chen had developed her course on prosecutorial ethics had established the Elena Rodriguez Fellowship for students committed to careers in public service. The fellowship provided full tuition support for students who agreed to work for government agencies or non-profit organizations focused on civil rights and public integrity. The program had attracted some of the most talented law students in the country. Elena's confirmation as U.S. Attorney had been celebrated by law enforcement agencies throughout Virginia, who recognized that her appointment represented a commitment to aggressive prosecution of corruption and civil rights violations. Police chiefs and sheriffs who had worked with Elena during her time as a federal prosecutor praised her fairness and her understanding of the challenges facing law enforcement. Officers who were trying to do their jobs with integrity. The courthouse security improvements implemented following Sterling's arrest had become a model for federal facilities throughout the country. Enhanced surveillance systems, improved background checks for court personnel, and new protocols for monitoring judicial conduct had created multiple layers of protection against future corruption. The measures were designed to deter criminal behavior while preserving the independence and dignity of legitimate judicial proceedings. Agent Kim's promotion to assistant director had given him oversight responsibility for public corruption investigations throughout the southeastern United States. His office had developed sophisticated analytical tools for identifying potential corruption patterns and had trained hundreds of agents in the techniques needed to build complex financial crime cases. Kim's methodical approach had become the gold standard for federal corruption investigations. The impact of the Sterling investigation extended far beyond criminal prosecutions and institutional reforms. Law schools had revised their curricula to place greater emphasis on legal ethics and the professional responsibilities of attorneys. Bar associations had strengthened their disciplinary procedures and created new mechanisms for attorneys to report suspected judicial misconduct without fear of retaliation. Elena's first State of the District address as U.S. Attorney focused on the themes of accountability, transparency, and equal justice under law. She outlined her office's priorities, which included aggressive prosecution of public corruption, protection of civil rights, and support for crime victims. Elena emphasized that her office would pursue justice without regard to the political affiliation, wealth, or social status of potential defendants. The address was delivered in the same courthouse where Sterling had been arrested, and Elena specifically referenced that moment as a reminder that no one was above the law. She spoke about the importance of institutional courage and the responsibility of prosecutors to challenge misconduct wherever they found it. The audience included many of the law enforcement officials, attorneys, and civil rights advocates who had supported Elena throughout her career. Marcus Chen had been featured in a documentary about whistleblowers and their role in exposing government corruption. The film highlighted Marcus's transformation from a frightened computer programmer to a federal law enforcement agent, emphasizing how individual courage could have far-reaching effects on institutional integrity. Marcus used his platform to encourage others to report misconduct and to support stronger protections for whistleblowers. Patricia Hendricks had written a book about her experience as the accountant who had triggered the Sterling investigation. The memoir provided a detailed account of how she had discovered the financial irregularities that led to the corruption prosecutions, and it offered insights into the personal costs and rewards of speaking truth to power. The book had become required reading in business ethics courses at universities across the country. The financial industry had undergone significant changes in response to the corruption revelations, with new compliance programs and ethical training requirements designed to prevent future criminal schemes. Professional associations had strengthened their codes of conduct and created new mechanisms for reporting suspected misconduct. The industry had recognized that maintaining public trust required constant vigilance against corruption. Elena's office had established partnerships with academic institutions to study the effectiveness of anti-corruption measures and to develop new approaches to preventing and detecting misconduct. The research partnerships had produced valuable insights into the psychology of corruption and the institutional factors that either encouraged or deterred criminal behavior among public officials. The Victim Compensation Program had been expanded to provide not just financial restitution, but also counseling and support services for individuals who had been harmed by corruption. Elena understood that the impact of corruption extended beyond financial losses to include psychological trauma and loss of faith in democratic institutions. The comprehensive approach to victim support had become a model for other jurisdictions. Judge Martinez's elevation to the Court of Appeals had created an opening on the district court that was filled by Sarah Walsh, Marcus Chen's former public defender. Walsh's appointment was seen as recognition of her dedication to justice and her role in supporting Marcus during the corruption investigation. Her confirmation hearing had emphasized her commitment to protecting the rights of all defendants, regardless of their background or circumstances. The Sterling case had become a fixture in law school constitutional law courses, where it was used to teach students about the separation of powers, judicial independence, and the role of prosecutors in maintaining the rule of law. Elena frequently spoke at law schools about her experience, emphasizing the importance of preparation, courage, and ethical reasoning in prosecutorial decision-making. Elena's office had prosecuted several high-profile cases involving police misconduct and civil rights violations, demonstrating her commitment to holding law enforcement accountable while supporting officers who served with integrity. The prosecutions had sent a clear message that constitutional violations would not be tolerated, while also providing training and support to help prevent future misconduct. The international attention focused on the Sterling reforms had led to Elena being invited to speak at conferences around the world about combating corruption and maintaining judicial integrity. Her presentations emphasized the importance of strong legal institutions, prosecutorial independence, and public transparency in preventing the kind of systematic corruption that had characterized Sterling's network. Agent Kim's unit had developed new investigative techniques using artificial intelligence and data analytics to identify potential corruption patterns across multiple jurisdictions. The technology had proven effective at spotting financial anomalies and communication patterns that might indicate criminal activity, allowing investigators to focus their resources on the most promising cases. The courthouse where Sterling's arrest had occurred had become a popular destination for tours focused on the history of federal law enforcement and the importance of judicial integrity. Visitors could see the courtroom where Elena had challenged Sterling's authority and learn about the investigation that had followed. The tours emphasized how individual courage could lead to systematic reform and institutional accountability. Elena's nomination and confirmation as U.S. Attorney had been covered extensively by national media, with journalists highlighting her role in the Sterling case and her commitment to prosecutorial integrity. The coverage had emphasized Elena's background as the daughter of immigrants and her rise through the federal prosecutor ranks based on merit and dedication to justice. The reforms implemented following the Sterling investigation had been credited with preventing several potential corruption schemes that might otherwise have gone undetected. Enhanced monitoring systems and reporting mechanisms had created an environment where misconduct was more likely to be discovered and addressed before it could cause significant harm to the justice system. Marcus Chen's success story had inspired other young professionals to consider careers in federal law enforcement, particularly in financial crimes investigation. His example demonstrated that individuals with technical skills and analytical abilities could make significant contributions to combating sophisticated criminal schemes. Marcus had become a recruiter for the Treasury Department, helping to identify and train the next generation of financial crimes investigators. Elena's first year as U.S. Attorney had been marked by several significant prosecutions that demonstrated her office's commitment to aggressive enforcement of federal laws. The cases had involved everything from healthcare fraud to environmental crimes, but all had been characterized by meticulous preparation and unwavering commitment to seeking justice for victims. The Sterling case had been featured in numerous academic studies examining the effectiveness of different approaches to combating corruption. Researchers had concluded that the combination of sophisticated financial investigation techniques, strong prosecutorial leadership, and institutional reforms had created a model that could be replicated in other contexts where corruption threatened democratic governance. Patricia Hendricks had established a foundation to support whistleblowers and provide legal assistance to individuals who reported government misconduct. The foundation had helped dozens of people navigate the complex process of reporting corruption while protecting themselves from retaliation. Patricia's work had demonstrated the ongoing need for strong whistleblower protections and support systems. The courtroom where Elena had confronted Sterling had been equipped with new technology to ensure complete transparency in judicial proceedings. Digital recording systems captured every word spoken during hearings, and new protocols required public disclosure of judicial financial interests and potential conflicts. The measures were designed to prevent future corruption while maintaining appropriate judicial independence. Elena's leadership of the U.S. Attorney's Office had attracted talented prosecutors from across the country who wanted to work for someone with her reputation for integrity and effectiveness. The office had become known as a place where prosecutors could pursue complex cases without political interference, and where career advancement was based on merit rather than connections. The impact of Elena's confrontation with Sterling continued to reverberate through the legal profession years after the initial arrest. Young attorneys cited Elena's example when they encountered ethical challenges in their own practices and her willingness to challenge authority when justice demanded. It had become a touchstone for prosecutorial courage and integrity. Agent Kim's investigation had ultimately led to changes in federal law that strengthened penalties for judicial corruption and expanded the authority of law enforcement agencies to investigate misconduct by public officials. The legislation had been passed with bipartisan support and had been signed into law by a president who recognized the importance of maintaining public trust in democratic institutions. The Sterling case had demonstrated that even the most sophisticated corruption schemes could be detected and prosecuted when law enforcement agencies had the resources and authority they needed to investigate complex financial crimes. The success of the investigation had led to increased funding for public corruption units and enhanced training for agents and prosecutors who specialized in these challenging cases. Elena Rodriguez had begun her career as a young prosecutor, hoping to make a difference in her community. Through her courage in confronting judicial corruption and her subsequent leadership as U.S. Attorney, she had helped transform the federal justice system and restore public confidence in democratic institutions. Her example continued to inspire a new generation of public servants committed to the principle that justice should be available to all Americans, regardless of their background or circumstances. The courthouse where it all began remained a symbol of both the potential for corruption within powerful institutions and the ultimate triumph of individual courage over systematic misconduct. Elena's name had been added to the honor roll of distinguished public servants, but more importantly, her example had become part of the institutional memory of the federal court system, reminding future generations that the price of justice is eternal vigilance and the courage to speak truth to power. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.